right, welcome back to another episode of the Psychiatric podcast. I'm your host, Investigator Slater, and if it is your first time here, welcome. If it is your 100 and whatever time here, welcome home, freak. Welcome, seriously, one and all, to October and to the inaugural episode of Spook-o-pedia, which officially kicks off an entire month of true crime content of the spooky, creepy, gory, and or haunted nature. Literally, this is the first episode in Spook-o-pedia. I could not be more excited. Some cases this month will be rooted in urban legend, some in gore, others in just classic true crime flavor with like a twist of goosebump-inducing horror. But no matter the story we cover, by the end of each episode, you are going to feel it. Maybe you're going to find yourself double-checking the lock on your door, or you're going to glance at the mirror and see a face staring back that isn't yours, with eyes too wide, smiling when you aren't. Maybe the corners of your house, the shadows under your bed, the staircase down to your basement start to feel less like spaces you own and more like places where someone or something waits. And in the silence between your heartbeat and your next breath, maybe you'll come to feel that whatever's there is there for you. And it's patient and it's hungry. So that's the feeling I'm talking about. Happy October and welcome to Spook-o-pedia. Also, if you want more of this content, particularly spooky again this month, head over to patreon.com/psychopediapod, where you're going to get Slaterpedia, which is an additional true crime episode, full version that you will not get anywhere else. But this month, it's going to be obviously spooky and horrible and creepy. You're going to get Unhinged, Be My Guest, where Patreon members join me as my guest on air for an episode, which is incredible because I love getting to know you guys. And I love having you guys experience like the whole on-air thing. It's exciting. It's a good time. And you're also going to get a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, particularly this month, because I'm going to try on a bunch of costume options because Halloween is a very, very big deal for me. And I'm going to have you guys, patrons, vote on your favorite ones. And then we'll see what survives and what makes the cut for Halloween. It's always going to be creepy. Like, I don't do the typical, no offense to anybody who does. I'm not throwing shade. But like, I feel like we always say this. People always say there's two types of costumes for girls on Halloween. There's like the slutty kind, and then there's the just ridiculous kind, like the gory, the creepy, the over the top, the giant inflatable pumpkin, like just the total opposite. I'm in column B, but like to the extreme. That's my vibe, but I need help this year. I'm in a little bit of like I don't know, what's the word? Like not writer's block, but like costume writer's block. Like I can't figure it out this year. So I'm like, let me defer to the patrons. You guys know me the best, and I feel like you have my back. So if you want to help figure out what I'm going to be for Halloween and see me in different costumes and cast your vote, now's the time to jump into Patreon. On that note, I want to shine some light on some of the new patrons that we have this week. Everybody over on Patreon deserves a light on them, truly. We are like a little family over there. This weekend I had I called it an out-of-body experience. That's how it felt. Like I really was not in my own head. I did not feel like I was in my own body. It was the weirdest feeling. And I posted a video from my car being like, I know this is a safe place, so I'm just going to tell you guys what's going on right now. The feedback that I got from the patrons and like the real helpful advice, like people were explaining how it was a disassociation moment, maybe a panic attack, and they were giving real advice, like to put ice cubes in my hand, to splash myself with cold water, to like switch it up sensory-wise, and it really, really helped. So I thanked everybody over there, but I'm thanking everybody again. And now I want to just give some propers. This week we have Danny Junko's Sir Lancelot, Amy in the Ambulance, and Amy in the Ambulance was just on Unhinged, Be My Guest. She was just my guest co-host, and it was amazing. A Little Bit Witch, which reminds me of the song from Schitt's Creek, A Little Alexis. La, 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 la. A Little Alexis. Anybody who knows Schitt's Creek is going to love that just happened. Twinless Twin. I'm an actual twin, so Twinless Twin freaks me out a little bit. And Tanya. Those are just a handful. I wish I could list everybody who joined and everybody who's been with me from the beginning, but I don't have the time to do that here and now. But I thank you all so much for your support over on Patreon. And I thank everybody who's listening right here, right now, wherever you are listening to this. So without further ado, I just want to get started. So let's go. They say walls remember. If that's true, then the walls of abandoned asylums aren't holding memories. They're hoarding trauma like dust in the cracks. The screams, the sobs, the scratching nails, the endless shuffle of suffering feet down linoleum halls slick with bleach, blood, and brokenness. Step inside and the air turns heavy, damp, almost syrupy, and clings to your lungs, and the very act of breathing feels like a mistake. Paint peels in strips like rotting skin sloughing off bone, curling onto the floor in sickly, yellowed curls. Rust streaks down iron doors, and every shadow looks just a little too occupied. These were supposed to be places of healing, sanctuaries for the suffering, the lost, but too often they became cages where neglect, cruelty, and unthinkable quote-unquote treatments carved deeper wounds than the illness they claimed to be curing. Ice baths, electroshock, lobotomies done in back rooms with more precision given to sharpening the scalpel than to saving the soul. Now, many of those same halls stand hollow. But make no mistake, they are not silent. Visitors and paranormal investigators swear that they hear the brutal clank of restraints snapping shut and iron biting into phantom wrists. Doors don't just slam, they crack like gunfire and rattle on their hinges, though no hand that we can see has touched them. And in the small hours when the abandoned buildings are at their blackest, the chorus begins. Hoarse, overlapping cries, the sound of throats long decomposed, still pleading, still begging, still clawing for release that never came. And today, we're going back inside. Back into the dark heart of places where sanity was the price of survival and where even death couldn't empty the wards. This is the case of haunted asylums, inmates forever. The devastating reality is that the asylums of old promised care, but very often delivered cruelty. And the torment, whether intentional or dressed up as care, inflicted on thousands of vulnerable patients belongs as much to the realm of true crime as it does to medicine. Individuals who were already vulnerable, those who needed compassion, understanding, and care, were warehoused, locked away, experimented on, and subjected to treatments so harsh they bordered on or absolutely qualified as torture. These individuals were even referred to as inmates rather than patients or residents, which is like, obviously that was why I put that in this title, when I said this is the case of haunted asylums, inmates forever. Inmate is not my term at all. And I think that's why so many of these places are now believed to be haunted, because suffering doesn't just vanish when doors and windows get shuttered. It leaves something behind, half alive, half dead, and wholly eternal. When you walk into one of these abandoned hospitals today, or even just circle the exterior, as I have done recently, the air still feels heavy with that pain. And maybe that's what the hauntings really are. The voices of people who were never heard in life, still reaching out, still begging for dignity and compassion even now. Or maybe those voices aren't pleading at all. Maybe they're sharpening. Maybe they're the echoes of the forgotten, no longer asking, but taking. Not whispers for mercy, but whispers of revenge. We begin today at Pennhurst State School and Hospital. To understand what Pennhurst became, you have to step back into the mindset of the era, an era that locked away the psychologically vulnerable, excused cruelty as care, and called it progress. Overcrowding, abuse, and neglect turned Pennhurst into a place of torment. And when it finally shut down in 1987, which was in my lifetime, it left more than just an empty building behind. Countless paranormal investigators and visitors firmly maintain that Pennhurst is one of the most haunted asylums in America. Pennhurst opened its doors in 1908, and it had the grim title, quote, the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. It was originally envisioned as a sanctuary. However, it swiftly transformed into an overcrowded repository for society's most marginalized groups, including individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, immigrants, criminals, paupers, and orphans. By 1913, the state-appointed Commission for the Care of the Feeble-Minded, which is a disgusting phrase, by the way, which we will circle back to, and it's obviously not my terminology, but the commission disturbingly classified these individuals as unfit for citizenship and a menace to the peace, exacerbating their stigmatization and isolation. The commission was tasked with investigating and shaping policies concerning the care of those deemed quote-unquote feeble-minded, a term that then referred to people with intellectual disabilities who had a mental age between 2 and 12 years old. Following the establishment of this dehumanizing label, over 60 institutions across 31 states were set up to provide permanent care for citizens deemed feeble-minded and/or epileptic, marking a significant era of institutionalization, based on intellectual capacity in America. According to the 1890 federal census, Pennsylvania had the largest number of quote-unquote feeble-minded citizens in the United States. That number was 8,753, and thus Pennhurst was opened in Spring City, Pennsylvania. Now, in terms of the broader cultural climate, this was the period when eugenics theories gained traction and posited that individuals with intellectual disabilities pose genetic threats, necessitating control over their reproduction to prevent passing their conditions to future generations. This belief in the science of better breeding, that's in air quotes, which you cannot see me doing, but I'm doing in studio, suggested that self-sufficiency, independence, or any improvement in the lives of people with disabilities was basically unachievable. Pennhurst's chief physician, Dr. Charles Harrison Fraser, who was heavily influenced by these ideologies, only reinforced the notion that feeble-mindedness, or quote-unquote idiocy, was an incurable and hereditary defect. Echoing the sentiments of eugenicist Henry H. Goddard, Dr. Fraser stated, quote, every feeble-minded person is a potential criminal. The general public, although more convinced today than ever before that it is a good thing to segregate the idiot or the distinct imbecile, they have not as yet been convinced as to the proper treatment of the defective delinquent, which is the brighter and more dangerous individual, end quote, which is like a horrific set of sentences that I just said. The prevailing solution of the era, championed by Dr. Fraser and his contemporaries, was forced segregation and sterilization. The idea was simple, yet horrifying. Isolate those deemed unfit to walk amongst us and prevent them from reproducing, thereby eliminating the so-called threat at its root. It was a chilling precursor to the far more extreme measures later adopted by the Nazis, who shifted from elimination to just outright extermination. In Pennsylvania, this ideology manifested in the first documented covert sterilizations, tubal ligations, and castrations carried out on people branded as feeble-minded, their futures stolen under the guise of science. 24 states enacted involuntary sterilization laws for people with intellectual disabilities, and it began in 1907 with Indiana. As the decades wore on, the numbers swelled. By the late 1920s, reports indicated a staggering 18,000 so-called mental defects in Pennsylvania, half of them young women of childbearing age. To eugenicists of the era, that was not simply a social concern, but a biological crisis. Dr. Fraser, along with a cadre of physicians, scientists, and university researchers, responded by reshaping the very language of the system. They crafted new terminology and reframed institutionalization not as temporary care, but as a lifelong preventative measure, a way to literally quarantine and neutralize those they deemed threats to both genetic purity and social stability. Their guiding principle, chilling in its simplicity, was this: detect early, protect always. The unspoken truth was that protection meant locking people away indefinitely. Inside Pennhurst Asylum, this philosophy manifested in the cold, dehumanizing categories that defined every patient. So individuals were reduced to a handful of labels: imbecile or insane for the mind, and epileptic or healthy for the body. And these stark classifications dictated not only how people were treated, but how they were seen, less as human beings than as data points in an experiment to control heredity. Pennhurst itself became a world apart, a sprawling, self-contained complex deliberately cut off from the surrounding community. It ran its own power plant, enforced its own security, and grew its own food. From the outside, it might have looked like an orderly institution, like a closed little town perched on the edge of Spring City. But this isolation was by design. The locals preferred to keep their distance, and the institution was only too happy to oblige. Behind its walls, the unwanted and the vulnerable disappeared, out of sight, out of mind, and in many ways, out of humanity. Pennhurst stood starkly as a somber testament to the devastating failures of institutional care. Dubbed the shame of Pennsylvania by the press years later, this facility epitomized the severe maltreatment that was characteristic of such institutions of the time. During the mid-1960s, amidst a burgeoning awareness of civil rights, a man named Bill Baldini, who was a fledgling reporter, really exposed the horrific realities of Pennhurst through a groundbreaking 5-episode expose on Philadelphia's TV 10, which is now an NBC affiliate. And his series, which was called Suffer the Little Children, revealed shocking scenes of neglect and abuse within the walls of the Chester County institution. The flickering black and white images on the television screen captured adult patients confined in oversized cribs, their limbs bound as they rocked, paced, and twitched, manifestations of their profound mental and physical struggles. Baldini recounted the impact on his crew, and he stated, quote, "We started shooting, and my crew was mortified. I mean, I had trouble keeping them on the job because they were literally getting sick from what they saw." End quote. Adults and children were constrained to beds, severely undernourished, and infants were crammed into metal cages, some abandoned in their own waste. If you're wondering how and why infants were institutionalized, it was either because they were born with visible disabilities, things, back then like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, hydrocephalus, which is, hydrocephalus is like extra brain fluid. So basically, you can kind of tell the symptoms of hydrocephalus, not always, but usually the head is enlarged. There are certain telltale physical signs and other developmental conditions. And their families were told by doctors that such children were defective and would never live a quote-unquote normal life. Another reason why there were so many infants at Pennhurst is because Pennhurst housed women who'd been committed for intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, or even simply for being deemed unruly or immoral. And some of these women became pregnant, sometimes consensually, but very often through abuse or assault inside the institution. And then those babies were almost always taken away from their mothers at birth and then raised inside the asylum. There were entire nurseries inside Pennhurst, just rows and rows of cribs lined with unwanted or discarded babies, many of whom were malnourished and neglected. And I'm going to say also, not unwanted or discarded babies, just babies that were taken from their mothers. Survivors and investigators have described infants left crying for hours with untreated medical issues in an overwhelming atmosphere of abandonment. The other older residents, often lucid yet withdrawn, navigated daily life overwhelmed by a cacophony, noise, of noises in a place both loud and frightening, devoid of mental stimulation they so desperately needed and deserved. Pennhurst was severely overcrowded and housed 2,791 individuals, which is nearly 900 more than its capacity. This overpopulation was compounded by a crumbling infrastructure, a staggering $4 million budget shortfall, and a dire lack of adequate staff, with only 9 medical doctors and 11 teachers, none of whom, by the way, specialized in the education of those admitted. One harrowing scene from Baldini's documentary highlighted the institution's cold, calculated response to internal conflicts, which were happening abound. A physician described his method for dealing with a violent inmate by administering an injection specifically chosen to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage. The scenes of caged children and images of half-naked children and adults wandering aimlessly in an overcrowded day room, accompanied by a clamor of horrifying sounds, just assaulted the senses at every turn. This neglect and abuse confined individuals within an institution that allocated less daily funding for their meals than zoos did for feeding its animals. Now, it's important to recognize that the failures of Pennhurst were not solely the result of malicious intent by an evil staff. For the most part, the staff believed that they were doing the right thing, guided by the prevailing ideas of the times. Kind of. I mean, I'm going off script here. Like, all the sources are very clear to put that disclaimer in, and I do agree with that. I do think that a lot of people that were working inside of these institutions were told by their superiors that this was like the treatment, this was the cause, and they just kind of blindly followed. You know, sometimes there is pain in treatment, right? Like chemotherapy is not pleasant. Things, that's just an example off the top of my head. But then there were other things going on. I just feel like anybody with a human spirit, a human soul, would just know intuitively, this ain't right. You know what I mean? So I understand that, many people were thinking they were doing the right thing, but I can't subscribe to the fact that everybody thought they were doing the right thing. I think people took it too far. They were looked at as less than human. So if a member of the staff thinks that they're dealing with somebody who doesn't feel the way a human being feels, who doesn't think the way a human being thinks, who doesn't have, isn't made of the same stuff, if you will, then maybe they do, really believed that this cruel treatment was the course to take. I don't see how, but, it is what it is. The custodial model of care was inherently built on neglect and almost guaranteed suffering because they were less about care and more about containment. So the true issue was society's goal of warehousing and segregating people with disabilities, implying, if not overtly stating, that these individuals were different, other, subhuman. The terrible things that happened occurred because society allowed it to for so long. To that end, pop quiz. What was another lovely term used at this point in time to describe individuals with intellectual and/or physical disabilities? A, inconvenient people. B, hindered souls. C, shadow beings.
So I'm going to go shadow beings.
You gentlemen are incorrect.
It's inconvenient.
It is. It is indeed. The term that they used horrifically to describe individuals with intellectual and/or physical disabilities was inconvenient people. If that ain't telling of how these individuals were thought about or not thought about in society, I saw one newspaper article written around this time, and the title of the article was "A Vast Junkyard of Wasted Humans." It's almost like they couldn't even be bothered to give it a more intense name. Do you know what I mean? It's so telling. It's so dehumanizing. I hate it. Now, let's delve deeper into the specifics of what exactly happened at Pennhurst. Even now, former residents of the institution continue to struggle with PTSD due to the trauma they endured. Much of the information I am going to share, by the way, comes from a landmark lawsuit filed by Terry Lee Holderman, a young woman who suffered 40 different unexplained injuries during her decade at the institution. Decade at Pennhurst. Her allegations of abuse led to the first lawsuit of its kind in the United States, a federal class action, Holderman v. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, which asserted that the developmentally disabled in the care of the state have a constitutional right to appropriate care and education. Amen. The lawsuit charged that the facility had grossly violated the rights of its patients and demanded accountability for their suffering. So in 1908, the first buildings of Pennhurst were constructed on a 634-acre property, geographically isolated to enhance segregation. These included dining halls, kitchens, storerooms, cottages, teachers' homes, laundries, and power stations. The sprawling Pennhurst Asylum campus resembled a small city with its network of over 30 interconnected buildings. Fucking massive. These structures were linked by fireproof tunnels and walkways, which sadly also served as hidden locations where some staff reportedly raped residents. I think this is where my earlier, riff came from, tangent, whatever, about how, I can't get behind the fact that all the staff members felt that they were doing, the right thing. Come on. The campus housed essential services like a barber shop, dental office, and medical office, and was staffed with social workers, therapists, and psychologists. The buildings were strategically designed to cater to two distinct purposes. One group dedicated to education and industrial/agricultural activities like raising livestock and cultivating vegetables, and the other designed for custodial or asylum functions. The idea was for the residents to live as self-sufficiently as possible. Children attended school on the campus, and once they aged out, the young men were forced into demanding physical labor jobs on the farm for no pay and with punishment if they refused. They were also forced to care for the less capable men at the asylum. Women, meanwhile, were forced into the roles that conformed to notions of quote-unquote true womanhood and were employed in patient care or in domestic sectors like the kitchen, laundry, or sewing rooms. Men and women were never allowed to interact freely. The quote-unquote work boys and work girls were woken before 5 a.m. every day to start their long days, which ended directly after dinner, reinforcing the strict and punishing regime that was only slightly modified once the 1960s rolled around. Humanity truly clung by a thread at Pennhurst, which lacked psychological support staff during nights and weekends, leaving residents in crisis unattended until regular staff hours resumed. Because apparently mental collapse was expected to, respect business hours. Restraints, both physical and chemical, were commonly used, not as therapeutic measures, but as substitutes for adequate staffing. Residents were confined in seclusion rooms as punishment or physically restrained to beds and chairs for hours, days, or even longer. Chemical restraints involved the liberal use of tranquilizing drugs to manage behavior rather than treating very real conditions. The physical conditions at Pennhurst were dire. The environment was not just unsuitable for learning, but was so deplorable that it led to regression of already acquired skills. Basic sanitation was often neglected, with living areas frequently soiled with urine and feces, contributing to frequent outbreaks of disease and infestation. The facility stank of excrement and throbbed with a brutal soundscape. Patients wailing through the night, bed frames slamming against concrete like steel cages, doors banging shut with the violence of gunfire, pipes rattling like bones, and a constant undercurrent of muttering that could erupt into shrieks without warning. It wasn't just noise, it was psychological warfare, a never-ending assault that stripped residents of peace, privacy, and the last shreds of their sanity. Despair was inescapable. Violence and abuse were rampant, with injuries from assaults, including sexual assaults, by other residents being a common occurrence, and also by staff members. Staff abuse was actually well documented, with incidents ranging from physical assaults to rape, often leading to very, very severe injuries or worse. The legal testimonies painted a very grim picture of a place where the vulnerable were not only unprotected, but were subjected to the very threats they were supposed to be shielded from. One former resident, a man named Ronald Johnson, entered Pennhurst at just 13 years old. He was repeatedly raped by older boys, and when he reported the incidents, his pleas were met with absolute silence. Another man named Jerome Iannuzzi Jr. also entered Pennhurst at age 13 and later told a reporter that he was routinely beaten by employees and forced to sit completely naked in a freezing cold room for hours at a time. Ice-cold baths were another form of punishment. At other times, Jerome was strapped to a chair and electrocuted or placed in solitary confinement. Vaccine and psychotropic drug experimentation, sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Pittsburgh, began in the 1940s, even as the Nuremberg codes were being written. So the code was formulated to ensure that future medical experiments would adhere to basic ethical principles, notably obtaining voluntary consent from subjects, the necessity of scientifically valid research, and the requirement to avoid unnecessary suffering. Additionally, patients at Pennhurst were subjected to forced lobotomies, electroconvulsive therapy, X-rays, and radiation exposure. There were cases of mercury poisoning and other serum-based impurities amongst children, along with an outbreak of influenza which reportedly killed scores of children. Research virologists, immunologists, pediatricians, and infectious disease specialists all routinely worked with the staff at Pennhurst under the guise of research, where hundreds of innocent and vulnerable children and adults became human test subjects exposed to live viruses. Many patients were subjected to dental procedures without anesthesia, forcibly restrained during the process. Moreover, numerous patients were shackled and confined in windowless closets and actual cages, deprived of any sensory stimulation for prolonged periods of time. So if they weren't mentally breaking down before, they sure as shit were after. Tragically, several residents died from self-inflicted injuries, either intentionally or due to grossly inadequate supervision. Often only 2 or 3 staff members were available to care for as many as 80 patients. In some horrific instances, unsupervised patients leapt to their deaths down a top-floor laundry chute, plummeting to the basement below. Frequent injuries such as blindness, teeth violently extracted, and broken limbs were commonplace, arising from both neglected residents inflicting self-harm to staff members inflicting deliberate harm. For minor offenses like biting, for example, children were punished by having their teeth extracted without any Novocaine. Other tragic deaths unfolded under these dire circumstances as well, including one resident who choked to death on a state-issued sock. Additionally, a young man died from burn injuries after starting a fire, a heartbreaking event made worse by the fact that his family was never informed of the true cause of his death. Furthermore, many residents suffered from muscle atrophy due to a lack of proper physical therapy and exercise. Pennhurst remained open and operational somehow for 80 years and saw more than 10,600 residents, until finally, mercifully, in 1987, when it was forced to shutter its doors. The closure was significantly influenced by a landmark legal case, which I mentioned earlier, Halderman v. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, which actually began in 1977. This lawsuit, which as I mentioned was class action, was brought on by half of the residents who argued that the conditions at Pennhurst violated their constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause, as well as their rights under various federal statutes. The case resulted in a federal court decision that found the conditions at Pennhurst to be unsanitary, inhumane, and dangerous, and that they violated the civil rights of the individuals residing there. Judge Raymond J. Broderick ruled that the state was required to provide services in the least restrictive environment possible and to treat individuals with intellectual disabilities with respect to their individual developmental needs. This ruling was monumental and led to a nationwide shift towards community-based services for people with disabilities rather than institutionalization, like let's treat people instead of warehousing them. Additionally, the public became increasingly aware of and outraged by the conditions at Pennhurst in particular due to media coverage, including the series I mentioned earlier, published and televised by journalist Bill Baldini. Faced with legal actions, financial burdens, and growing societal push towards deinstitutionalization, and following a grueling 32-day trial, the decision was finally made to close Pennhurst for good. And the entire horrific saga helped mark a huge turning point in the care of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in which the status quo moved away from segregated institutions and toward community care settings. But this would not be the last the world would hear about or see of Pennhurst Asylum. Because today, Pennhurst, now privately owned, operates as a haunted house attraction, which I have some feelings on. Again, going off script here, when you know about the real human suffering that happened inside that institution, I don't know, the fact that it's used for entertainment now feels not great to me. I understand it. It's a, we're all here for the same reason, right? We like the spooky. We like to be freaked out. We like to think that there are spirits. There are paranormal investigators who truly do this for a living and try to connect with spirits and what have you from beyond. That said, I don't know. I don't know how I feel. I do know how I feel about a haunted house attraction at a place where so many lives were lost, so many people suffered, so many children were tormented. They literally offer like popcorn inside the facility, and you can watch old footage. It just feels funny. But let me tell you about what is supposedly haunting the halls of Pennhurst today. In Pennhurst's abandoned halls, silence is not peace. It's a predator waiting to pounce. That stillness is broken not by comfort, but by sounds that do not belong to the living. Apparently, doors slam with bone-rattling force, echoing like gunfire through corridors where no human hand remains. Footsteps march in rhythmic pursuit, never seen, only heard, always just behind you, as if something unseen knows your pace, your pulse, your fear. From vacant rooms, retching and gagging rise like the death cries of invisible sufferers, as though patients are still trapped mid-agony, choking on neglect that never ended. And then there's the child. Witnesses whisper of a little girl, pale and flickering, wandering the dim passageways. She drifts at the edges of vision, always in the corner of your eye, her gaze heavy with grief too vast for words. They say that she doesn't appear to terrify, but sorrow can be more terrifying than rage. Her silent melancholy feels like an invitation to look deeper, to see the cruelty written into these walls, to acknowledge the neglect that no one ever answered in her life. Not every spirit at Pennhurst wears sorrow. Some wear menace. On the third floor of the Mayflower building, men are suddenly racked with nausea, collapsing under an oppressive force. A hulking shadow figure over 6 feet tall is said to stalk that level, crouched in wait. Witnesses describe the sensation of hands tightening around their throats, strangling them into submission until they are forced to flee. Beneath the building, the horror only deepens. In the basement, which is known as the King's Lair, lurks a presence as cruel in death as he was in life. Because the king, who is believed to be the spirit of an abusive maintenance worker who worked at Pennhurst, is no passive phantom. He is violent, lecherous, and diabolical toward women. Female visitors have felt icy hands on their bodies, choking, grabbing, holding them in the dark. Those who have entered describe the king as territorial, an entity that wants not just to haunt, but to dominate. And apparently he isn't alone. In the Devon building, which was once a dormitory for patients, investigators capture clear electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs, whistling, voices that hiss and groan through the static of recorders. Each floor is alive with whispers of the condemned. In the basement lies the cruelest irony, not just the King's Lair, but a children's play area once called Candyland. But there is no sweetness left, only shadows, only rage. Here, a dark entity is said to prowl, lashing out with claws of unseen force, physically assaulting anyone foolish enough to enter. Much of the old equipment remains in the buildings, things like wheelchairs, hospital beds, medical devices, the electroshock therapy chair, and the dentist chair. A visit to the quote-unquote attraction that is now Pennhurst includes attendees watching a condensed version of Suffer the Little Children, the documentary I mentioned earlier, while also viewing pictures of actual lobotomies. The rooms are filled with fake bodies, severed limbs, and a soundtrack of screaming patients playing in the background. Actors dressed as both evil doctors and nurses, as well as patients screaming in agony, are inside the facility. The patients are muzzled and restrained in an attraction called, quote, Dungeon of Lost Souls. It intentionally mingles real history with lore and myth, heightening the thrill and fear factor. When Pennhurst Asylum first opened as a tourist attraction back in 2010, it was listed in Haunt World magazine as the scariest haunted attraction in the United States. At Pennhurst, the line between Asylum and hell collapsed long ago, but the echoes of abuse and despair did not die when the gates closed in 1987. They linger still, pacing the corridors, vomiting agony into the silence, reaching for throats in the dark. So that was Pennhurst. Another place where spirits are said to linger is one that I actually grew up near, as did Matt, really just literally 5 minutes away from my childhood home. For as long as I can remember, it's been part of local lore that the Pilgrim State Psychiatric Facility is haunted. Though the hospital, which is located in Brentwood, New York, is still operational, whispers center on the behemoth section of the building, long since closed, where shadows and stories refuse to die, and also a rooster, because I went there 2 weeks ago maybe, with firefighter Dave and Cash to walk the grounds. Anytime I can get boots on the ground with like anything relating to something I'm covering on Psychipedia, I will do it. Just to see if I got like a vibe, to see if there was any way inside, whatever. Would you know that a rooster, or as Dave said, a giant cock, showed up out of nowhere? This is an abandoned, desolate, enormous industrial type of building, and a rooster came at us out of nowhere. Tell me it's not haunted. I'll wait. I won't believe you. It's haunted. It was definitely some kind of paranormal rooster. Like, I'm convinced of it. Now, there was a farm that used to exist at Pilgrim State. I don't know if you knew that, Matt.
Did not.
I didn't either. Somebody actually messaged me because I posted about this. But this rooster, this was something else entirely. Anyway, so the shadows and the stories at Pilgrim State refuse to die. And I personally roamed the grounds, as I said, a few weeks prior to this recording to see if I could put my fingers on the pulse or the lack thereof of whatever still lingers. And I will say this, and Matt, you can let me know if you agree or disagree, but there is for sure an energy there. Heavy, restless, impossible to ignore. He's smiling, so I don't know what that means. I think he's not buying into it, maybe.
I mean, you definitely were uncomfortable when you're in there. Yeah, it had the feeling like it was shut down overnight and that everything was just left behind. Case files were there, beds, desks, everything was still there. As well as like empty beer bottles from other people who had gone in before I allegedly went in.
True. Yeah, no, it's always been part of Long Island lore. Like, I'd never been inside and I never braved it, when I was younger, but I did recently go there. I did post a video on my Instagram feed when I went a couple of weeks ago. I will repost it when this episode comes out. So if you are listening to this right now and you want to see some footage of my time at Pilgrim State, check out @Investigator Slater on Instagram and I will repost. Named for Dr. Charles Pilgrim, the state's commissioner of mental health at the time, the massive Victoria brick buildings opened on October 1st, 1931, and at that time, it was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world. Its size has never been exceeded by any other facility of its kind, though the part that is operational now is far smaller, than it once was. Once the most populous psychiatric institution in the world, it swarmed with close to 18,000 people with more than 4,000 staff members, all on 800 acres. Pilgrim was less a hospital than a self-sustaining city. Like Pennhurst, it had its own power plant, post office with a unique postmark, even its own Long Island Railroad station, which I had no idea about. Police and fire departments patrolled the grounds while greenhouses, a working farm, and a cemetery marked the rhythm of daily life and death. There are also unmarked graves there and still there, which is terrifying and heartbreaking. There was a nursing school with dormitories for students, and the executive staff lived like nobility in sprawling mansions modeled after English country estates. What remains of Old Pilgrim today, though the state still operates, as I said, a psychiatric facility on the grounds, feels absolutely overwhelming. The ruins rise with an aura that goes beyond bricks and mortar. So for me, when I was there, my instinct screamed that something unspeakable happened here. And of course, sadly, my instincts were correct, because the treatments at Pilgrim were anything but healing. Patients were strapped into medieval restraint devices that hadn't changed since the Dark Ages, their bodies bound as if they were beasts to be contained rather than humans to be helped. Electricity was forced through their skulls in brutal shocks. And then there were the lobotomies, the so-called miracle cure of the mid-20th century. Okay, a lobotomy wasn't just a hole in the skull. It was the destruction of connection. The procedure targeted the fibers linking the frontal lobes, so the part of the brain that governs judgment, personality, and decision-making, to the thalamus, the relay center that processes emotion, sensation, and memory. Those fibers are like the brain's telephone wires, carrying messages that make us who we are. Sever them, and the conversation between thought and feeling is silenced. In practice, it was nothing more than a crude knife to the brain. During lobotomies, like the early ones in the 1930s and 40s, patients were generally put under general anesthesia so they wouldn't feel the drilling into the skull. They were also sometimes given electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, right before, which doubled as a way to render them unconscious. Later lobotomies, like in the 1940s and 50s, were the transorbital method, aka the ice pick lobotomies. And as the name suggests, these were far cruder. A long spike, akin to an ice pick, was hammered through thin bone behind the eye socket into the brain, where the patient remained awake while this was happening. Surgeons would sometimes ask patients to move their eyes or speak or answer questions mid-procedure to monitor brain function and ensure that they didn't, quote unquote, cut too far. And what the fuck you gonna do about it if you did? And even more horrific and terrifying, these were often done with only local anesthesia, like electroshock or sometimes nothing at all. The idea was to make the procedure quick and office-friendly and doable without an operating room, like a fucking dental cleaning. Dr. Walter Freeman, who popularized the method, sometimes performed them with no more equipment than a hammer, a pick, and a chair. He once did 25 lobotomies in a single day. These surgeons would drill or hammer their way through bone, then slice through bundles of white matter with a swinging motion using a fucking kitchen instrument. The theory was that cutting these pathways would calm the storms of mania or aggression. But of course, the reality was horror. Some patients emerged passive, dulled, their violent outbursts extinguished, yes, but so was their personality. Others were reduced to slack-mouthed shells, unable to speak or control their own bodies. Memories were erased. Emotions, when they flickered at all, were childlike and fractured. Patients who once screamed and fought now sat drooling, staring, and silent. It was not healing. It was amputation, not of a limb, but of identity. A very famous example of an awake lobotomy gone wrong was the case of Rosemary Kennedy in 1941. While performing the standard prefrontal lobotomy, doctors James Watts and Walter Freeman asked the 23-year-old woman to sing and count. When she became incoherent, then the doctor stopped. But the surgery by that point left her permanently incapacitated with the mental capacity of a young child, and she required lifelong institutionalization after that. Physicians could take their scalpel to anyone institutionalized who displayed aggression, carving personality into silence, and the results were absolutely devastating. Between the 1940s and the 1950s, over 2,000 Pilgrim State patients were lobotomized. To put that in perspective, 1 out of every 25 lobotomies performed in the United States was carried out within Pilgrim's walls. Even the famous were not spared. In 1947, poet Allen Ginsberg's mother, Naomi, was lobotomized at Pilgrim with the consent of her 21-year-old son. She lingered there until her death 9 years later. Allen Ginsberg carried that tremendous guilt into his work, immortalizing Pilgrim's shadow in Kaddish, which is a poem, and again in the fevered lines of Howl, where he described, quote, Pilgrim State's fetid halls bickering with the echoes of the soul. Pilgrim promised care, but what it delivered was mutilation, silence, and ghosts. With the exception of dry medical reports, little has actually been written about Pilgrim State, except for a very chilling memoir that surfaced in 2009, titled Pilgrim State, and written by Jacqueline Walker, who recounts how her mother, Dorothy, was swallowed by the asylum in 1949. Dorothy, you see, hadn't lost her mind. She'd lost her husband's loyalty. Her philandering spouse drugged Dorothy, then had her committed to rid himself of her responsibility, meaning like he didn't want her as a wife anymore. What followed, Walker calls tortured. In front of her young children, Dorothy was bound in a straitjacket and hauled away, condemned not for madness, but for inconvenience. At Pilgrim, she was subjected to electroconvulsive shocks so violent that they left her body convulsing and her memory absolutely shredded. If she wasn't mad before, Walker later said, who could go through all that and come out whole? Dorothy begged to see her children, but the system was deaf to her pleas. She did suffer from depression, understandably, but she was also joyful, vibrant, and desperate to return to her family. Instead, Pilgrim State erased her. Walk the abandoned grounds of Pilgrim State Psychiatric Facility on Long Island, and you'll feel it before you see it. The air hangs heavy as if the buildings themselves exhale sorrow. Cracked windows gape like sockets, and ivy claws at the brick, trying to reclaim a place that was never meant to exist like that. Even though part of Pilgrim State is still operational, the sealed-off, huge building, as well as the other shuttered wards, are where the whispers concentrate. Inside, the silence isn't empty. It is said to be oppressive. Doors are said to slam shut with no warning, their echoes rolling down the corridor like thunder. Voices drift from vacant rooms, murmurs, sobs, sometimes screams so piercing they feel like they're meant for you. Shadow figures slip across the halls, darting at the edges of sight, gone the moment you turn your head to look. Investigators say that the energy inside Pilgrim is restless and volatile, hauntings born not of mystery, but of misery. Some claim to hear the faint buzz and crackle of old electroshock machines, though the power has been long cut. Others feel sudden pressure at the temples, a crushing sensation behind the eyes, as though the lobotomies performed there are still replaying through the air itself. The scale of mutilation that happened at Pilgrim has left an imprint. People leave the wards who, bust inside, feeling nauseated, disoriented, and with the sense that they've carried a piece of that suffering out with them. And then there's the graveyard, which I did not know that there was a graveyard at Pilgrim. Pilgrim buried its dead in plain numbered markers, stripping them of even their names. Ghost hunters swear the cemetery is alive with activity. EVPs, which are electronic voice phenomena, capture sobbing and desperate prayers, while others describe feeling watched by dozens of unseen eyes. To walk there is to know you're not alone, not above ground, and not beneath it. Pilgrim's legacy is written not only in books, but in the dust of its abandoned corridors. Journalist Michelle Troring once slipped inside with friends, guided only by the beam of a miner's headlamp. What they found was grotesque still life. A rusted gurney frozen mid-roll, its wheels locked in place as if still carrying a body that never made it out. A gynecological chair dumped at the base of a staircase, its stirrups ripped away like torn limbs, and graffiti smeared across the wall in black that said, "I cannot corrupt that which has been corrupted." Pop quiz. What was discovered on the floor of the kitchen by someone who recently managed to enter the dilapidated ruins of Pilgrim? A. Condoms. B. Bloody rags. C. Sporks. Matt, when you're done cracking up.
I'm sporks, man, I mean, I think someone found a bloody rag. People break glass, they get cut, they have to heal themselves, they leave it behind. Bloody rag.
You guys, they found a shit ton of sporks. I don't know how else to make this into the script, so I made it a quiz. They found a shit ton of sporks. So here's what I'm thinking. Maybe the residents were not permitted to use forks, so sporks are slightly less pointy. Now, as I've said a bunch of times, I feel like by this point there is still a psychiatric hospital on the grounds that's open today, and it's set in a modern building with 510 beds providing inpatient and outpatient services. Now, there are residents who go and receive services at Pilgrim State, and then they have the ability to come and go as they want. My family and I always see two residents in particular who walk from the facility to a coffee shop that I go to a lot. And every time we see them, we buy them coffee. My children are extremely adamant about it. And compassion in action is never a lesson wasted. Okay, I'm afraid that I have saved, arguably, the worst facility for last. And I hate ranking it because it's all horrific. But we've arrived at the New Jersey Lunatic Asylum, a.k.a. New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton, a.k.a. the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. Please, everybody understand, I am not calling it a lunatic asylum. Okay. May 15th, 1848, the day the New Jersey Lunatic Asylum opened its gates in Trenton, New Jersey, the state capital. The first asylum in the state and the first in the country designed under the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride Plan was a standardized architectural plan for mental asylums developed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride in the mid-19th century to provide a humane, structured, and self-sufficient environment for patients based on moral treatment principles. Characterized by a quote-unquote bat-wing floor plan with a central administration building and staggered outward-reaching wings, it literally, like I saw the blueprints, it literally looks like a bat. It aimed to ensure patients had access to sunlight and fresh air, promoting recovery and a return to the community. The blueprint, as I said, it is really creepy. I have to take a second to shine a light on Dr. Kirkbride for a minute, because what a G. Formerly trained as a surgeon, Dr. Kirkbride gained early experience caring for the mentally ill and was appointed as the very first chief physician of the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, a position that he would actually hold for an astonishing 43 years, right up until his death. In the time the hospital itself became synonymous with his name, people simply calling it Kirkbride's. This beautiful man was not the stereotypical asylum doctor of his era. He championed what was then called moral treatment, a philosophy rooted in compassion, dignity, and respect for those society deemed quote-unquote insane. He believed that patients thrived when granted freedom rather than shackles, and he insisted that mental illness did not strip people of their humanity. They are not disabled from appreciating books or enjoying many intellectual and physical comforts, he wrote. And remarkably, despite the absence of modern medications or therapies, roughly half of his patients eventually recovered and returned to their communities, a striking accomplishment for the mid-19th century. Based on his observations, Dr. Kirkbride estimated that 1 in every 500 people suffered from insanity. The most common triggers for institutionalization, according to his records, included grief, chronic illness, intemperance, and anxiety. But in the 1800s, doctors had a very different and often unscientific understanding of what could cause insanity. Things like religious excitement, tobacco use, prolonged lactation, metaphysical speculation, nostalgia, even excessive exposure to the sun's rays. Dr. Kirkbride also argued that humane treatment wasn't just morally right, but it was also economically sound. Caring for patients in hospitals, he insisted, cost society only 1/10 of what it would take to support an uncured, chronic case for life. In October of 1844, early in his tenure, Dr. Kirkbride played host to a gathering that would shape the future of psychiatry. 13 superintendents from asylums across the country convened in Philadelphia to form the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, the first national medical society in the United States. That association would eventually evolve into today's American Psychiatric Association. So anyway, the then called New Jersey Lunatic Asylum was the first hospital in the state to design its facility according to the Kirkbride Plan. It was a sprawling fortress of long corridors and radiant windows, its architecture intended to heal by design, to let in light where there was only darkness. And on paper, it was salvation, a sanctuary for those socially abandoned. But the road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. And here, those intentions became sharpened scalpels. By the 20th century, the asylum was no longer a refuge. It was a torture-laced prison, a place where the broken were discarded, where the cries of the sick bounced down endless echoing corridors and died in the walls. When Dr. Henry A. Cotton took command of the facility in 1907, that prison, for the next 20 years, and there really is no other word for it, transformed into something even worse, a butcher's workshop. Henry Cotton trained in Europe, and his gospel was infection. And this is what we touched upon earlier, meaning he preached that madness came not from the mind, but from rotting teeth, festering tonsils, and diseased bowels. And this is known as focal infection theory, which is the historical concept that many chronic diseases, including systemic and common ones, are caused by focal infections, which are localized infections, often asymptomatic, that cause disease elsewhere in the host. Therefore, Dr. Cotton believed that he could cure insanity, he claimed, if he could cut the sickness out of the body. And so, he began with the patient's mouth. Patients were strapped down in crude wooden chairs, jaws pried open with iron gags. No antibiotics and very little, if any, anesthesia. Just the metallic taste of blood flooding the tongue while pliers cracked through molars one by one. Screams choked into gurgles as droplets of blood arced across white aprons. The clang of teeth hitting enamel trays like coins tossed into a wishing well. And when the madness lingered, Dr. Cotton carved deeper. Tonsils were slit away in ragged cuts and sinuses were scooped raw. If the patient still showed signs of mental struggle, he moved further into the bowels of the body. Literally, he excised colons, pulled out gallbladders, severed ovaries, cut testicles free, and split open stomachs. Patients woke feverish with hot pus weeping from unwashed incisions, the reek of infection rising in waves. They were not healed, they were mutilated. Walking the ward meant staring into toothless faces sunken, mouths caved in, gums ulcerated and raw. Patients trying to chew broth that slid down their chins in strings of blood and spit. Conversations reduced to lisps and guttural moans because Dr. Cotton had stolen not just their teeth, but their ability to speak. They shuffled like ghosts in endless hallways, hollowed, humiliated, waiting their turn for the knife. And the patients knew what was happening to them. They whispered of the operating rooms as they witnessed their friends and neighbors disappearing, only to be wheeled back, bandaged, trembling, or not at all. Panic infected the wards more than tuberculosis ever had, and TB was huge, rife during this time. Some clutched door frames until their fingernails ripped off as they were dragged into the surgical chamber by force. Others screamed prayers into the night, begging for either God or death to just intervene. The staff answered with restraints and chloroform. Dr. Cotton published glowing reports boasting of his cures. He manipulated numbers, padded results, and basked in the admiration of American and European peers. They saw a savior. His patients saw a sadist. When Dr. Phyllis Greenacre of Johns Hopkins arrived in 1924, which was the year my Grammy was born, to investigate, she was absolutely horrified. She wrote about ward after ward of patients without teeth, their mouths like craters, speech garbled into nothing. Meals were grotesque pantomimes. The records were total chaos and bullshit, lies stacked upon contradictions. And yet, when she tried to sound the alarm, she was ordered to stop, and her report was buried. So, Dr. Cotton kept cutting. Even when illness came for him, he doubled down. He diagnosed himself with infected teeth, ripped them out, and declared himself cured. Proof, he said, that he'd been right all along. Proof that the slaughter should continue. Henry Cotton eventually died in 1933 of a heart attack, not at the end of a surgeon's scalpel, but in his own bed. And when he did, the world mourned him. The New York Times called his death a tragedy, while journals praised him as one of medicine's greatest men. They didn't see the morgues filled, the wards silenced, the fields seeded with bodies. Pop quiz, motherfuckers. Which statement is true? A. Dr. Henry Cotton was a student of Dr. Alois Alzheimer. B. Dr. Henry Cotton forced patients to eat what he called healthy feces from other patients, claiming it would replace their diseased gut bacteria with stronger, cleaner microbes. C. Dr. Henry Cotton claimed that prolonged hiccups were an early sign of schizophrenia, prompting him to surgically cauterize parts of the diaphragm to cure the spasms.
I want to say A, but I don't know the timeline of when we discovered Alzheimer's disease.
Well, you're right. You're right. Nice. I just thought that was very interesting. I just think it's interesting when history intersects. You know what I mean? So this fucking sadist was a student of Dr. Alois Alzheimer. Interesting shit. Wanted to include it. From Dr. Cotton's perspective, he was treating what he believed to be the root cause of all insanity, namely focal infection or the perils of pus infection. If we're being kind, we could say that Cotton was well-meaning in his efforts, but woefully mistaken in his approach. Because regardless of intention, Dr. Henry Cotton's legacy was hundreds dead and thousands mutilated. His asylum, the shining beacon of compassion, had become a death house, a place where the weak were bled, cut, and carved in the name of science. To this day, if you walk those abandoned halls, you can hear it. The clatter of teeth spilling onto trays and the wet rasp of a saw cutting through bone. The cries of the toothless damned, forever choking on the blood of their own so-called cure. Many paranormal researchers maintain that they've captured or glimpsed the following ghostly activities: Dr. Cotton's apparition, by sight, not photographed; ghosts of patients with missing limbs, by sight, not photographed; disembodied voices, but no clear EVP; and orbs. Many paranormal enthusiasts believe orbs are spirits trying to communicate or manifestations of residual energy, like the emotional imprint of a deceased person. As we close the doors on these haunted hallways, it's worth remembering that the ghosts of asylums are not always supernatural. They are echoes of pain, neglect, and human suffering, the lives that were forgotten, dismissed, or broken within those walls. The creaking floors, the flickering lights, the whispers in the corners. Maybe they're reminders of what we failed to see, what we failed to protect, and what we cannot unhear. So when you leave this first Spook-o-pedia episode today, don't just fear the shadows. Fear the silence that allowed them to exist. Because some horrors are not locked away in the past. They live on in memory, in neglect, and in the stories we dare not tell until now. And the last thing the walls ever whisper isn't a ghost. It's a warning. Remember them, or we are doomed to repeat it. And that's the case. Which is both true crime and spooky shit. I think it was the right way to introduce Spookipedia. I hope everybody agrees with that. Disclaimer, I am not encouraging or recommending that anybody break inside of Pilgrim Seat or anywhere to see if it's haunted. I swear to God, I have like such a split personality on this general topic because on one hand, I get sucked into the lore, into the hauntings, and I'm a spooky girl by nature. But on a human level, I hate making it an attraction. I hate making it an activity. I hate making, you know what I mean? Like, real human beings suffered tremendously there. And we're like, oh my God, there's still a bed. There's still a wheelchair. There's, you know, like, God, somebody's child was in that wheelchair. You know, I'm very caught. Pennhurst is my understanding is Pennhurst is trying to open up an actual museum, like on the campus, on the site, like an actual, let's learn about what we went through as a nation, how we, have treated people who needed our help the most, and like make it a learning thing. But right now, it's, as far as I know, just a haunted house. Okay, I want to offer a palate cleanser before I let everybody go today. And this palate cleanser is a little different than my usual type of palate cleanser. So I apologize in advance if this makes you throw up in your mouth a little bit, but damn, if ever there was someone who could reach inside your chest, scoop out the panic, and hold the pieces like they mattered, it's Firefighter Dave. And that is who this palate cleanser is about today. So I had a tough weekend. I've been struggling with anxiety lately, and it has admittedly been tearing me apart from the inside. But it never fully takes me out because I have somebody outrageously patient and steady holding me up while the world collapses around us all. He listens to the same broken story again and again and again, no matter how many times I need to replay it. He lets me vanish into his arms. He catches me every time I spiral, and he does it, I don't know how, with love. Not obligation, not because it's expected, but because he chooses me and my well-being over and over again. I have truly never met anyone like Firefighter Dave, and I can't believe he chose me, but thank goodness he did, because he saves me in ways that I can't even explain. So I hold on to him like my life depends on it, because truthfully, it does. So this palate cleanser is dedicated to Firefighter Dave. Go hug somebody you love. Go try and make this world a better place, because it's tough. It's very, very dark right now. If you want a little levity and you want to go on my costume searching journey with me, join me on Patreon right now, because obviously what I'm going to do with my costumes is an October thing. After October, I'm not doing that. So now is a great time to join. Once you're there, you're going to see how much you love it, and you're going to want to stay, I hope, because we really are like a family over there. But I do plan on trying on many Halloween costumes, modeling it, and then having y'all vote on which ones, freak out the most, because that's what I'm going for. Patreon.com/Psychopediapod. Thank you all so much for listening today and always. And I can't wait to see you guys next week for another Spook-o-pedia episode. Thanks for listening. Bye.